Usually when we look at the massive, the invisible systems that keep our modern civilization running, there is this baseline expectation of structural precision.
Right, you expect that someone somewhere actually did the math.
Exactly. Think about structural engineering for a second. If you stand under a massive suspension bridge, like, say, the Golden Gate Bridge or the Akashi Kaikyo, you are looking at thousands of tons of steel and concrete just suspended in midair.
And you don't panic.
You don't, because the engineer who designed it can point to a very specific, set of mathematical equations. They can calculate the tensile strength of the steel cables. They can measure the yield point.
They can map out the stress-strain curve. I mean, it is a world completely governed by Young's modulus and the strict, unforgiving laws of physics.
Right. The math is visible. It's verifiable.
And most importantly, it is universally agreed upon. A load-bearing beam either supports the weight or it fractures. There's just no ambiguity in the physics of a bridge.
But then, you step out of the realm of civil engineering and you step into the world of global security. Specifically, the architecture that is supposedly preventing a global thermonuclear war.
And that pristine mathematical framework just evaporates.
It completely evaporates. Suddenly, you aren't looking at physics anymore. You are looking at a landscape that is incredibly murky, highly subjective, and relies entirely on a high-stakes psychological guessing game.
It really is the ultimate intellectual blind spot.
So today, we are unpacking a foundational text of global security for you. It's a deep dive into a book from 1983 by Patrick M. Morgan called Deterrence, a Conceptual Analysis.
And the core premise we're exploring today is genuinely heavy. I mean, humanity has essentially bet its entire survival on this concept called deterrence.
Right.
Yet, as Morgan meticulously lays out in his analysis, we might have a shockingly poor understanding of the tensile strength of the cables holding our geopolitical bridge together.
Which is terrifying, honestly.
It is. And what makes Morgan's text so vital, even decades after it was first published, is his willingness to open up the black box of strategic military doctrine and expose all the contradictions inside.
So here is the mission for today's deep dive. We are going to break his argument down systematically. We'll start by stripping deterrence down to its primitive behavioral roots.
Then we really need to examine the massive, almost utopian assumption that military strategists have made about human rationality.
Yeah, that part is wild. And from there, we'll unpack the hidden, everyday societal costs of living inside a deterrence-based world. Because those costs affect everything for you and me, from domestic budgets to the very structure of our democratic institutions.
And finally, we will arrive at Morgan's crowning insight, which is the crucial, widely misunderstood distinction between general and immediate deterrence.
Which exposes a fatal flaw in how nuclear superpowers actually plan for war. Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with the foundation.
Right. Before we can critique the mechanics of global security, we need to actually define the tool holding it all together.
Because we hear the word deterrence thrown around constantly on the evening news, usually by politicians standing in front of flags, treating it like it's some sort of impenetrable high-tech energy shield.
Yeah, it sounds very scientific when they say it.
Exactly. But what is the actual mechanical definition Morgan uses?
Well, Morgan strips away all the political rhetoric and boils it down to behavioral manipulation.
Okay.
At its absolute baseline, deterrence is manipulating someone's behavior by threatening them with harm to prevent them from doing something.
So a threat.
Just a threat. When you apply that to the specific realm of international politics, it becomes the explicit threat of using military force to prevent the first use of military force by an adversary.
Right. You are promising a devastating reaction to maintain the current status quo.
Exactly. If you cross this specific line, I will inflict a specific amount of pain on you.
It sounds incredibly straightforward, almost like an upgraded high-stakes version of the penal system,
Yeah.
We build prisons and threaten people with incarceration to deter them from committing crimes.
Because we assume the threat of the punishment outweighs the benefit of the crime.
Right. Or, to bring it down to an even more relatable analogy, it's essentially a global version of the cookie jar threat.
The cookie jar threat.
Yeah, like if you steal a cookie, you get a timeout. It's how we train toddlers.
The penal system and the toddler analogy are both good parallels. But Morgan points out something deeply uncomfortable about this dynamic.
Which is?
When you really look at the mechanism of threatening violence to prevent violence, you realize it is a remarkably primitive form of statecraft.
Oh, totally.
Think about when we actually rely on direct, overt threats in our daily lives. We use it when sophisticated communication, mutual understanding, diplomacy, or moral persuasion have utterly failed or simply aren't possible.
Right, it is a crude behavioral lever.
Exactly.
But wait, can we really scale up the psychology of a toddler facing a timeout to a superpower facing thermonuclear war? Doesn't the sheer scale of the harm change the psychological mechanism?
I mean, you'd think so. That's the paradox.
Because we have managed to split the atom, we have mapped the human genome, we've built quantum computers, we have reached the absolute pinnacle of technological and civilized sophistication.
And yet,
And yet, the ultimate guarantor of our existence, the absolute bedrock of our global peace, relies on a psychological mechanism that is essentially indistinguishable from two cavemen holding heavy rocks glaring at each other across a fire.
it's an incredible paradox.
Yeah.
We are serving caveman psychology with quantum-level weaponry.
It's so unsettling when you frame it like that.
And that paradox made the intellectuals and strategists of the mid-20th century incredibly uncomfortable, too.
I bet.
You have to remember the historical context here. The foundations of modern deterrence theory were built in the 1950s and 60s, primarily at places like the Rand Corporation, by people who had just witnessed the mechanized slaughter of 2 world wars.
Right, the stakes had never been higher.
They possessed weapons. They could end civilization in an afternoon. So to manage this primitive tool of mutual threat, you might assume they would turn to psychology or sociology or even psychoanalysis, right?
To understand the deep, instinctual roots of human fear and aggression, yeah. Because if deterrence relies entirely on a threat, you are fundamentally in the business of manufacturing fear.
Exactly. You are trying to induce a specific emotional state in your opponent's mind that paralyzes their trigger finger.
Right.
You would think they'd study fear, but the strategists went in the exact opposite direction.
Wait, really? What did they do?
Instead of engaging with the messy, unpredictable reality of human emotion, primal fear, and psychological neurosis, they decided to model international conflict as if it were a perfectly contained game of chess.
Oh, wow.
They turned to game theory, to economics, to models of hyper-rationality.
So if the entire system was built on the assumption that world leaders act like flawless, calculating machines, how does that actually map onto the reality of human decision-making?
It doesn't, at all.
Because just looking back at the history of the 20th century, the rational actor model seems like a massive leap of faith.
It is the weakest load-bearing pillar in the entire architecture of deterrence. And Morgan attacks this assumption brilliantly.
How so?
The formal deterrence theory of the Cold War rests almost entirely on this rational actor paradigm. The assumption is that an opponent is a perfectly rational entity.
Like a monolith.
Exactly. A monolith that meticulously weighs the costs and benefits of any potential action on a mental spreadsheet, possessing perfect information and acting without any emotional bias whatsoever.
It's a very Enlightenment-era view of humanity. It assumes a world run by philosopher kings or brilliant accountants.
Right. The logic is that if we can guarantee that the cost of attacking us, what strategists famously called unacceptable damage, is mathematically higher than any conceivable geopolitical benefit the enemy might gain, they will rationally, logically choose to stand down.
But the irony Morgan highlights is that this pristine mathematical model was constructed during a century that constantly proved how irrational humans actually are.
Completely.
Yeah.
I mean, the origins of the First World War weren't the result of a careful cost-benefit analysis.
Not at all. The combatants essentially sleepwalked into a global slaughterhouse due to this toxic cocktail of nationalism, bruised egos, interlocking defensive treaties, miscalculation, and hubris.
And even the Second World War, Hitler's decision to open a two-front war by invading the Soviet Union while still fighting Britain wasn't a triumph of rational calculation.
Right. It was driven by deep ideological obsession and megalomania.
Exactly. We live in a post-Freudian world where art, literature, and modern psychology have made us acutely aware that humans are driven by subconscious desires, biases, and emotional blind spots.
Yeah, we know this about ourselves.
Yet, when the stakes are elevated to the survival of the human species in a nuclear standoff, we suddenly abandon all of that psychological insight and pretend that the people with their fingers on the button are perfectly logical algorithms.
The danger there is that we designed a safety system for a vehicle, but the system assumes the driver will never get tired, never suffer momentary louds of judgment, never get angry, and never operate on faulty information.
And when you build a system for a flawless user and hand it to a flawed human, failure is inevitable.
It really is. So if the rational actor is a myth, they must just be flying blind, which means deterrence is literally just gambling on the mood of an opponent on any given Tuesday.
It's a terrifying thought.
But Morgan doesn't just tear down the rational actor model, right? He offers a replacement. How does he think leaders actually operate if they aren't perfect calculators?
Right, so he introduces the concept of sensible decision-making, which is a massive downgrade from rational decision-making, but far more accurate to the human condition.
Okay, sensible decision-making. What does that look like?
To build this, he pulls from several heavy-hitting organizational theorists. He relies heavily on Herbert Simon's concept of satisficing.
Satisficing. That's a portmanteau of satisfy and suffice, right? Let's unpack the actual mechanism of that, because it feels crucial to understanding how a crisis actually unfolds.
It is absolutely crucial. Simon argued that human beings possess bounded rationality. We just don't have the brain power, the time, or the perfect intelligence network to calculate every possible outcome of a complex decision.
So if a leader is facing a geopolitical crisis, they cannot mathematically map out all 10,000 potential cascading effects of their next move.
Exactly. So instead of looking for the mathematically optimal maximum benefit solution, a stressed leader looks for the first available option that simply satisfies the immediate problem and suffices to keep them in power and avoid immediate disaster.
They aren't trying to win the game optimally, they're just trying to survive the next round.
Right. And Morgan also brings in Charles Lindblom's concept of disjointed incrementalism.
Which is a very academic way of describing the act of muddling through a problem, right?
Muddling through is exactly how governments operate. Sensible leaders who are burdened by incomplete intelligence, exhausted by lack of sleep during a crisis, and pressured by domestic political rivals, they avoid making massive, irreversible, apocalyptic leaps.
They don't just wake up and decide to launch a full-scale nuclear first strike out of the blue.
No. Instead, they take small, pragmatic, incremental steps. They test the waters. They try to keep their options open.
Okay, this is where I see a massive friction point.
Go for it.
If human leaders operate by satisficing, taking tiny incremental steps to muddle through a situation, how does a massive apocalyptic deterrent threat actually stop them?
That is the exact problem Morgan highlights.
Because, he uses the early United States involvement in Vietnam as a prime example of this, right? The U.S. didn't declare total war on day one. They sent a few dozen military advisors.
Right.
That is a tiny incremental step. It doesn't cross the threshold of a massive response.
And then they send a few more.
Then some helicopters.
And before you know it, you have 500,000 troops on the ground. And extracting yourself requires a massive, painful, politically ruinous decision.
Exactly. So if an opponent is stuck in that kind of incremental trap, taking one tiny step after another, a giant deterrent threat is useless.
It is.
You cannot threaten to drop a thermonuclear bomb over a border skirmish, or the deployment of 50 advisors, or a minor cyber attack. The threat is completely disproportionate to the incremental step.
That is the paradox of the sensible leader. On paper, a sensible, risk-averse leader is the perfect target for deterrence because they genuinely fear massive consequences.
Right.
But in reality, their preference for tiny, disjointed steps means they can slowly, almost imperceptibly slide into a severe crisis without ever taking one single definitive action that justifies triggering the massive deterrent threat.
Wow.
Deterrence theory was built for a black and white world where adversaries take massive leaps over clear red lines. But geopolitics is entirely composed of gray areas and creeping thresholds.
So if deterrence is this primitive, psychologically flawed tool that completely fails to account for how humans actually satisfice their way into conflicts, we really have to look at the massive toll it takes on the societies that deploy it.
The cost is enormous.
Because we aren't just holding a conceptual stance. We're paying trillions of dollars to maintain this posture. What are the actual tangible costs of the deterrence machine?
The costs are staggering, and they go far beyond just the defense budget. Because deterrence is a crude tool relying on an unlikely psychological model. Making it appear credible in the real world forces societies into a permanent, highly paranoid defensive posture.
Because you can't just issue a threat and go home. You have to constantly, exhaustingly prove that you have the capacity and the will to execute the threat.
Exactly. Morgan points out several massive anomalies in the modern world that only make sense when viewed through the distorted lens of this deterrence trap.
Like the paradox of attitude versus action regarding war.
Yes. Globally, we have largely agreed that wars of conquest are terrible, unacceptable failures of civilization. The Kellogg-Briand Pact, the United Nations Charter, we formally abhor the act of war.
Yet, the threat of catastrophic military violence is embraced as the fundamental, everyday tool of global diplomacy. We have outlawed the act, but we have institutionalized the threat of the act.
Another glaring anomaly is the behavior of minor powers. Have you ever wondered why a small developing nation with a fraction of the GDP of a superpower will spend a massive percentage of its national wealth on a fleet of advanced fighter jets or submarines?
Logically, they know they could never win a protracted war against a major superpower. The math just doesn't work.
But they bankrupt themselves buying the weapons anyway, purely to maintain a localized deterrent posture. They are buying the ability to inflict a bloody nose, hoping that is enough to change the superpower's cost-benefit analysis.
And then there's the most terrifying anomaly of all, the reality of the stockpiles.
The overkill.
Yeah. A single modern nuclear warhead can erase a major metropolitan area. A handful can collapse a nation's electrical grid and end it as a functioning state.
Right.
Yet the global stockpiles number in the thousands. We maintain overkill capacity, the ability to destroy the world several times over. That serves absolutely no logical military utility. You can only kill an adversary once.
To fully grasp the societal price tag of maintaining these stockpiles, Morgan brings in the work of Charles Frankel. Frankel argued that the true costs of a deterrence-based foreign policy are structural, democratic, and psychological.
We aren't just talking about tax dollars diverted from infrastructure to intercontinental ballistic missiles.
No, we are talking about the excessive centralization of government power.
Because you cannot have a decentralized, slow, deliberative, democratic assembly managing a nuclear deterrent.
Exactly. If a launch sequence gives you a 15-minute window to respond to an incoming threat, you don't have time to convene Congress and hold a debate.
You are forced to consolidate the ultimate power of life and death into the executive branch. You have to build a massive, permanent, highly centralized national security apparatus that operates outside the normal speed of democracy.
Furthermore, Frankel points out that maintaining a credible deterrent requires the removal of major national policy domains from the electorate's inspection.
Right, because deterrence requires secrecy.
Yes. If your opponent knows exactly how your weapons work or where your submarines are, the deterrent fails. Therefore, you need classified weapons programs. You need black budgets that the public cannot audit.
You need covert operations.
And by doing that, you are fundamentally weakening the democratic oversight of the state, because the populace cannot be allowed to know what the state is doing in their name.
So, for you listening, think about what that means for your daily life. The structure of the government that taxes you, the extreme power of the executive branch, the vast swaths of government spending that remain hidden behind classification walls. All of this is justified by the invisible, insatiable demands of maintaining a global deterrence posture.
And Frankel notes the tragic side effect of this, the neglect of profound domestic problems.
Because when the singular, overriding existential goal of the state is warding off potential theoretical nightmares in the future, the actual nightmares happening right now, like poverty, decaying infrastructure, education crises, they are treated as secondary issues.
Morgan captures the absurdity of this entire arrangement with a brilliant, darkly comedic analogy. He calls deterrence a hair-of-the-dog cure for war.
Oh man, if you've ever had a severe hangover, you know the hair-of-the-dog concept. You drink a little bit more alcohol the next morning to stave off the sickness caused by the alcohol from the night before.
You are treating the poison with more poison.
Precisely. To preserve ourselves from the horrors of a clash of arms, we are arming ourselves to the teeth. We are building machines capable of rendering the earth uninhabitable in order to prevent violence.
We are threatening the ultimate violence to achieve peace.
It is a cyclical, logically fraught system that requires endless escalation just to maintain the status quo.
It's exhausting.
So if we are trapped paying these immense societal, democratic, and financial costs for a system that relies on a flawed understanding of human psychology, we have to look closer at the actual academic foundation.
We do.
What exactly do the experts think they are doing? Because Morgan essentially grades the homework of the entire national security establishment, doesn't he?
He does, and he finds that the very definitions of deterrence they are using are completely contradictory.
To fix a broken machine, you first have to agree on what the machine is actually supposed to do.
Exactly. But when Morgan surveys the leading academic definitions of the Cold War era, he finds a conceptual mess. Let's break down a few of the competing definitions he dissects. First, he looks at the work of Richard Brody and Roy Jones.
Okay, what's their take?
They attempt to draw a distinction between deterrence as a policy, which is a calculated, deliberate attempt by a state to induce an adversary to refrain from an action, and a deterrence situation, which they define as a state of affairs where conflict is contained within a boundary of unexecuted threats.
But Morgan calls out this distinction as a completely false dichotomy, right?
Completely.
A deterrence situation doesn't just magically manifest out of thin air like a weather pattern. It only exists because one or more actors are actively, aggressively pursuing a policy of deterrence. You can't separate the tense situation from the policies creating it.
Right. Then Morgan turns to Morton Halperin's definition. Halperin suggests that deterrence is simply the idea that the primary function of military force should be to prevent the use of military force by your opponents.
Wait, if the definition of deterrence is simply preventing the opponent from using military force, there is a massive, terrifying loophole there.
Let's hear it.
If my only goal is to prevent you from using your military, I don't need to threaten you. I could just launch a massive, unprovoked carpet bombing campaign against all your airfields and missile silos tomorrow morning.
And you've achieved the goal.
Exactly. I have successfully prevented you from using your military, thereby achieving Halperin's definition of deterrence. But that's a preemptive first strike that is the literal opposite of deterrence, which is supposed to be a defensive, reactive posture.
Your deduction is exactly why Morgan tears that definition apart. Halperin's definition is so broad that it essentially gives a blank check to offensive aggression, disguising it as defensive prevention.
It completely blurs the line between a shield and a sword.
It does. Morgan finally finds firmer ground with theorists like Robert Art and Kenneth Waltz, who define deterrence more strictly as frightening a state out of attacking via the explicit threat of severe punishment.
Okay, so to bring ultimate clarity to this, Morgan has to painstakingly separate deterrence from all the other reasons a sovereign nation might build a military.
Right, because there are many.
He identifies 7 distinct uses of military force. And I really want to dive deep into these because it reveals how easily lines get crossed in real-world geopolitics.
Let's unpack the 7. The first and most obvious use of military force is simply fighting.
Right, using violence to physically destroy the enemy's capability to resist.
The second is compelling surrender. This is using the threat of overwhelming force to make an enemy capitulate without a protracted battle.
Like forcing them to give up territory or political rights because the alternative is annihilation?
Exactly. The third use is domestic control.
This is essentially using the military as a Praetorian guard.
Wow.
We see this in authoritarian regimes, where the primary purpose of the heavily armed forces isn't to fight foreign invaders, but to suppress internal rebellion, intimidate political opponents, and keep a junta in power.
Well said. The fourth is status. Military hardware is the ultimate geopolitical luxury good. In the early 20th century, having a fleet of dreadnought battleships was how a nation signaled it was a major global player.
Today, it's possessing aircraft carriers or nuclear submarines. You build them not necessarily because you plan to use them, but because sitting at the adult's table of global diplomacy requires a massive military footprint. It is pure projection of national prestige.
The fifth use is ambition. This is building up forces with the long-term calculated intention of eventually pursuing greater territorial or hegemonic power, even if you aren't ready to strike today.
The sixth use is showing the flag. This is fascinating because it happens every day. It's when a nation uses troop deployments or naval patrols to project influence and signal commitment to a region.
A perfect modern example of showing the flag is the United States Navy conducting freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea.
Right, they aren't there to start a war, and they aren't explicitly threatening an immediate strike. They are sailing warships through contested waters simply to prove they can.
Signaling to allies and adversaries that they maintain a vested interest in the region.
And finally, the seventh use of military force is psychological security. Sometimes a government builds a massive military simply to make its own populace feel safe, regardless of the actual external threat level.
It is a very expensive form of national anxiety medication.
That's a great way to put it. Now, out of those 7 distinct uses of a military, Morgan argues that deterrence is strictly a very specific subset of just one type of action.
Right. It is only the threat to fight in order to forestall an unprovoked attack.
It is not compelling surrender, it is not showing the flag, it is not building status. It is purely the promise of retaliatory punishment to maintain the status quo.
But narrowing the definition down, that strictly exposes a massive real-world dilemma.
How so?
How does a nation prove that its weapons are strictly for deterrence and not for ambition or compellence? Morgan illustrates this epistemological nightmare with the shotgun neighbor analogy.
I want to build out the scenario because it perfectly captures the terrifying subjectivity of international relations.
It really is the core tragedy of the security dilemma.
So imagine you are looking out your kitchen window one morning and you see your neighbor who you generally get along with, but who you know has a temper installing a brand new, high-powered, automated shotgun on his windowsill. And the barrel is pointing directly at your front door.
Naturally, your heart rate spikes.
You walk over and demand to know what on earth he's doing. Your neighbor smiles warmly and says, "Oh, don't worry. This is purely for deterrence. It's just a defensive measure in case the neighborhood gets dangerous. I have absolutely no intention of shooting you as long as you don't attack me."
Right.
As a neighbor, does that explanation lower your heart rate? Does it make you feel secure?
Absolutely not. You are now living under the constant looming threat of lethal violence, dependent entirely on the good mood and stable judgment of the guy next door.
Exactly. You cannot verify his inner intentions. You can only verify the size of the barrel pointing at your house.
So what is your logical response?
You go out and buy a larger, more advanced weapon, and you point it at his house to deter him from using his deterrent. If every single nation on Earth claims that their nuclear arsenals and hypersonic missiles are purely defensive deterrents, but all their neighbors view those exact same weapons as an offensive existential threat, the definition of deterrence becomes entirely subjective. My peacekeeping deterrent is your apocalyptic threat.
And you've hit on a profound historical shift that Morgan explains. To understand the shotgun neighbor, you have to understand how the concepts of defense and deterrence were violently severed from each other by the invention of the atomic bomb.
Because they used to be the exact same concept.
For almost all of human history, they were synonymous. If a medieval king wanted to deter an invasion, he built a massive stone castle with high walls and a deep moat. If a 19th century nation wanted to deter an attack, they raised a massive standing army.
The deterrent threat was intrinsically linked to defensive capability. The message was, if you attack me, my defenses will absorb the blow, my army will defeat yours on the battlefield, and your invasion will fail. You deterred an adversary by proving you could successfully defend yourself.
But the advent of strategic bombing, culminating in intercontinental ballistic missiles carrying thermonuclear warheads, completely shattered that paradigm.
Because in the nuclear age, perfect defense is a technological impossibility.
Exactly. No nation, no matter how advanced, can guarantee they can intercept every single incoming hypersonic missile. And because a single missile slipping through the net means the loss of millions of lives, defense is effectively dead.
Wow.
Therefore, a modern superpower can entirely lack the ability to defend itself, but still possess the absolute ability to punish the attacker.
You no longer deter by promising a successful defense. You deter by promising mutual suicide.
Yes.
It is the difference between wearing a Kevlar vest, which is a defense, and standing in a room holding a live grenade with the pin pulled out, which is deterrence.
The grenade doesn't stop you from getting shot.
Right, but it guarantees the person shooting you will also die. And this subjective, terrifying nature of mutual threat leads us directly to the biggest blind spot in the entire strategy. We've defined what deterrence is supposed to be, but we still haven't agreed on why it actually works inside the mind of the adversary.
This brings us to what we might call the epistemological nightmare of deterrence.
Okay, lay it out for us.
If the neighbor sees your grenade and decides not to shoot, we have to ask a fundamental question about the mechanics of human nature. Why did they back down?
Right.
Are they paralyzed by visceral terror, reacting emotionally to the sheer horror of being blown up? Or are they acting like a cold, rational accountant, doing the math and calculating that the physical cost simply outweighs the geopolitical benefit?
And when Morgan analyzes the foundational literature, he finds a massive, unresolved contradiction among the leading experts.
A huge contradiction.
Some theorists, like Bernard Brodie, argued that deterrence functions primarily because of lurking fear. It's an emotional, almost biological response. The sheer unfathomable horror of a nuclear holocaust creates a psychological barrier that keeps everyone in line.
But other theorists insisted that fear is too unstable to rely on and argued deterrence works purely through cold, mathematical calculation.
This theoretical schizophrenia is most glaring in the work of Herman Kahn, right? He was arguably the most famous and certainly the most controversial nuclear strategist of the Cold War.
He was. Kahn famously wrote a book called Thinking About the Unthinkable, where he tried to apply rigorous mathematical modeling to nuclear war.
And Kahn's logic has a fatal flaw that Morgan completely exposes. Kahn argues that strategists need to calculate exactly how many weapons are required to deter a rational opponent. You figure out the breaking point on their spreadsheet. But then, Kahn acknowledges that the world isn't perfectly rational. So he argues we need to build a massive surplus of extra weapons, weapons far beyond what the math requires, in order to deter what he calls the irrational and irresponsible opponents.
Which is conceptually incoherent. It's trying to solve a psychological problem with an accounting solution.
It makes absolutely no sense. If an adversary is genuinely irrational, if they are a zealot acting on a messianic complex, or a dictator blinded by paranoia, or someone driven by deep psychological impulse rather than logic, how does adding more megatons to a spreadsheet change their behavior?
It doesn't.
If they aren't calculating costs and benefits to begin with, doubling the theoretical cost won't register with them. It is like trying to stop a charging, enraged bull by showing it a highly detailed PowerPoint presentation of the injuries it might sustain. The bull doesn't care about your chart.
That's brilliant. And the reliance on Kahn's logic highlights the sheer desperation of the Cold War theorist. They inherently knew the rational actor model was incomplete. They knew humans were capable of profound irrationality.
But the only tool they had in their intellectual toolbox was mathematical escalation.
So they applied more of the rational math, more warheads, more bombers, more overkill, to an irrational problem.
But beyond the psychological confusion regarding fear versus math, Morgan points out an even deeper philosophical trap. How do we definitively know deterrence has ever worked?
The impossibility of proving a negative. It's the ambiguous inhibition.
Exactly. The scientific method requires observable proof. To prove that a policy of deterrence is successful, you have to definitively prove why a specific event didn't happen.
Let's say State A issues a massive nuclear threat against State B, demanding they don't cross a border. State B does not cross the border. Did deterrence work? The politicians in State A will certainly claim a massive victory.
But how do you actually know the threat was the causal factor? Was the leadership of State B genuinely terrified by the threat? Did they calculate the costs and rationally decide to stand down?
Or is it entirely possible that State B never actually intended to cross the border in the first place?
Right. Maybe they were dealing with a massive internal economic collapse that diverted all their resources. Maybe their crops failed. You cannot empirically prove that the absence of a war was definitively caused by the presence of your specific deterrent threat.
Going back to your shotgun neighbor. If the neighbor claims his shotgun successfully deterred you from walking across his lawn, but the reality is you just stayed inside all day to watch television, he feels like a master strategist.
When in reality, his weapon affected absolutely nothing. He is taking credit for an event that was never going to happen.
So we have a system built on a flawed understanding of human rationality, relying on a deeply subjective definition of defensive posture, utilizing contradictory theories about fear versus math to achieve an outcome that we can't even empirically prove exists.
If that is the state of the art, what are we actually doing? How does Morgan resolve this massive conceptual failure?
He resolves it by introducing the most important paradigm shift in his entire book. He realizes that the confusion, the contradictions, and the inability to prove success all stem from a single, massive conceptual error made by the academic establishment.
What was the error?
They were treating deterrence as a single, monolithic concept. Morgan splits it into two distinct, fundamentally different realities.
This is the core thesis of the text, the groundbreaking distinction between what he calls general deterrence and immediate deterrence.
Right. Let's break these down meticulously, because this changes everything about how we view military spending and crisis management.
Let's do it. Let's start with general deterrence.
General deterrence describes the long-term, everyday, underlying relationship of hostility between two heavily armed opponents. In a general deterrence situation, adversaries maintain massive armed forces to regulate their relationship, even though neither side is anywhere near mounting an actual imminent attack.
It is the steady background hum of geopolitics. It is the status quo.
Right. This describes the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union for the vast majority of the 50-year Cold War, or the relationship between the United States and China today.
There is deep tension, there are opposing ideologies, and there are massive militaries constantly patrolling. But nobody is sitting in a bunker actively running the countdown to launch a preemptive strike.
Exactly. And the crucial mechanism to understand about general deterrence is how the military forces are actually shaped in this environment. The size of the defense budget, the types of submarines built, the deployment of troops. These decisions are not driven by the hyper-rational, pristine math of a sudden crisis.
No, they are driven by the messy reality of peacetime bureaucracy.
They're influenced by defense contractors lobbying for lucrative contracts, by inter-service rivalries between the Navy and the Air Force fighting for budget share, by domestic politicians trying to look tough on defense to win re-election, and by the vague psychological need of the populace to feel secure.
So general deterrence is political, incremental, and deeply inefficient. Okay, so general deterrence is the messy, bureaucratic, everyday reality. What is immediate deterrence?
Immediate deterrence, which Morgan sometimes refers to as pure deterrence, is a rare, severe, acute crisis. State A is seriously, actively, and imminently considering launching an attack. State B realizes this attack is coming and issues a specific, explicit, undeniable threat of overwhelming retaliation.
And State A decides at the very last second not to attack primarily and demonstrably because of that specific threat.
Exactly. This is the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. This is 13 days of pure, unadulterated terror where the world is standing on the absolute brink of annihilation and the leaders are actively staring down the barrel of the gun.
Yes. Immediate deterrence is the crucible. It is the moment where the theoretical rubber actually meets the road.
And what's fascinating here is this is where Morgan delivers his ultimate critique of the entire national security apparatus. The tragic flaw in modern strategic thinking, the reason the theories are so contradictory, is that we have profoundly confused these two realities.
How does that confusion actually manifest?
Think about all those vast, rigorous, hyper-mathematical theories of deterrence we discussed earlier. The intricate game theory models from the Rand Corporation. The exact calculations of what percentage of an enemy's industrial base must be destroyed to achieve unacceptable damage.
Right.
All of those immaculate theories were built by hypothesizing an abstract world of immediate deterrence. Theorists locked themselves in a room and imagined a sterile, perfectly rational, acute crisis moment to figure out how deterrence should work.
But policymakers, generals, and politicians almost exclusively live, operate, and spend money in the messy, bureaucratic world of general deterrence.
Exactly.
So we have built a massive, multi-trillion-dollar global architecture using theories designed for one specific extreme reality, but we're using them to govern a completely different everyday reality.
Yes.
It reminds me of the engineering of a Formula One race car. A Formula One car is a $1 million, highly tuned masterpiece of engineering, but it is designed for one specific extreme environment. A perfectly smooth track moving at 200 miles per hour, driven by an elite professional with flawless reflexes. In an F1 car, the engine relies on the sheer speed of the vehicle to force massive amounts of air into the radiators to cool the engine. It needs extreme speed to survive. That is immediate deterrence, clarity, speed, and extreme stakes.
But what happens if you take that Formula One car and try to use it for your morning commute?
Exactly. If you take that F1 car and put it in heavy stop-and-go city traffic in the rain, which is general deterrence, it is a disaster.
Yeah.
Because it isn't moving at 200 miles per hour, there is no airflow. The engine overheats and catches fire. The suspension shatters on the first pothole. It's a terrible, dangerous ride.
The machine was fundamentally not built for the environment it is being forced to operate in.
You are using the math of a racetrack to navigate a traffic jam.
That analogy perfectly isolates the mechanical failure Morgan is warning us about. And the danger of this mismatch isn't just that it leads to bloated defense budgets or inefficient bureaucracies. It is actively, existentially perilous.
Because the true danger arises when a severe crisis, an immediate deterrent situation, does finally erupt out of the everyday general deterrent status quo.
Right. Because the leaders involved can't just flip a switch and turn into the perfectly rational, emotionless calculators that the F1 theory demands.
When the red telephone actually rings, the leaders are still burdened by all the everyday baggage of general deterrence.
There are still politicians terrified of losing the next election if they look weak. There are still dictators paranoid about a military coup if they back down. They are physically exhausted. They are receiving contradictory intelligence from rival agencies.
The entire architecture of global peace assumes that human beings will suddenly transform into flawless, logical algorithms at the exact moment they are placed under the most terrifying psychological stress imaginable.
We are betting the survival of the human race on a psychological impossibility.
The F1 car is overheating and the driver is panicking, and this mismatch between the clean theory of immediate crisis and the messy reality of general peacetime makes the application of military force incredibly precarious.
It really does.
The lines blur, and states inevitably start trying to use the F1 car to tow a boat. Which brings us to a vital distinction that often gets completely lost in the fog of geopolitics. Because general and immediate deterrence overlap so much in the minds of leaders, states frequently misuse these tools.
Right, they use the military not just to prevent an action, but to force an action.
This is a critical threshold. We have to separate the concept of deterrence from the concept of compellence. They use the same weapons, but the psychological mechanisms are entirely different.
Let's draw that line clearly. Deterrence is a negative command. Do not do X or I will punish you. It is drawing a line in the sand, standing behind it, and waiting. It is maintaining the status quo.
And compellence.
Compellence is a positive command. You must do X or I will punish you. Or even more dangerously, you must undo X, an action you have already taken. You are using the threat of force to actively change the status quo.
Morgan uses a profound historical example to illustrate this difference: the dynamic between the United States and Imperial Japan in the late 1930s and early 1940s.
Yes, Japan had aggressively invaded China. The United States didn't just want to deter Japan from taking more territory. They wanted to compel Japan to retreat.
They used severe economic threats, including a crippling oil embargo, to try and force Japan to undo an action it had already committed blood and treasure to achieve.
And Morgan points out that the mechanics of compellence are infinitely harder, vastly more complex, and carry a drastically higher probability of catastrophic failure than deterrence.
Why is the psychological burden so much heavier? Why is it mathematically harder to make a nation do something than to make them not do something?
It comes down to the deep psychology of pride, status, and saving face. Think about the mechanics of compliance. If I successfully deter you from attacking me, you can simply do nothing. You stay home. And crucially, no one on the global stage necessarily knows that you back down out of fear.
Right, you can claim you never intended to attack anyway. You lose no face. Your domestic political standing remains intact.
But if I use a compellant threat, if I demand that you publicly retreat your army from a territory you already occupy, you cannot hide your compliance. You have to actively, visibly submit to my will in front of the entire world and in front of your own military generals.
The political and psychological cost of complying with a compellant threat is astronomical. It is humiliating.
Which means the threat required to achieve compellence has to be overwhelmingly, undeniably credible and severe. And if it fails, you have backed the opponent into a psychological corner where their only remaining options are total public humiliation or going to war.
Which is precisely the corner Japan found itself in. Facing the complete collapse of their economy due to the oil embargo and refusing the humiliation of a full retreat from China, they chose the only other option available: the preemptive strike on Pearl Harbor.
The compellant threat didn't just fail, it actively triggered the war it was supposedly trying to manage.
And this terrifying tension, the blur between deterrence and compellence, the inability to verify intent, the mismatch between hyper-rational theories and deeply flawed human psychology, all of it culminated in the stark, unyielding reality of the nuclear age.
It really did. And Morgan notes a profound philosophical milestone in this journey: the SALT agreements.
The strategic arms limitation talks between the United States and the Soviet Union in the 1970s. Why does Morgan view SALT as such a conceptual turning point?
Because the SALT agreements weren't just about counting warheads. They were the moment where both superpowers formally, legally ratified the concept of mutual deterrence. For decades, military scientists on both sides had been desperately trying to find a technological escape hatch from deterrence.
They wanted to invent a perfect shield. They researched massive anti-ballistic missile systems, or ABMs. The dream was to be able to fight a nuclear war and survive, rather than just relying on the primitive threat of retaliation.
But the SALT agreements, specifically the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, acknowledged a terrifying, counterintuitive truth. Unilateral attempts to escape mutual vulnerability are actually the most destabilizing, dangerous actions a nation can take.
It is the ultimate paradox of military logic. Let's say State A manages to build a perfect, impenetrable missile defense shield. State B instantly realizes that their deterrent threat, their ability to inflict unacceptable damage, is now entirely useless.
Right. State A could launch a first strike, and State B's retaliation would just bounce off the shield.
Therefore, State B's only logical, mathematically sound move is to launch a massive preemptive strike against State A before they can finish building the shield.
Exactly. By attempting to perfectly defend yourself, you actively provoke the exact apocalyptic attack you are trying to avoid. Your shield becomes the ultimate offensive threat.
So we are forced into a reality that defies thousands of years of human survival instinct. From the walls of Jericho to the armor of medieval knights, human instinct is to build a shield. But in the nuclear age, security relies entirely on ensuring your own vulnerability.
The only way to guarantee peace is to ensure that your enemy can completely destroy you, with the absolute certainty that you can completely destroy them in return.
Since a less than perfect defense is catastrophic, we have to abandon the concept of defense entirely and entrust the survival of civilization to the primitive, psychologically flawed mechanism of mutual terror.
It is a system built on shared existential dread, managed by tired, satisficing humans, using mathematical theories originally designed for flawless machines.
Wow. We have traversed a massive intellectual landscape today. Let's try to synthesize Morgan's profound, unnerving insights.
Let's do it.
What we've learned from Deterrence. A conceptual analysis is that the architecture keeping our world intact is not the pristine, structurally sound suspension bridge we want it to be. Deterrence is a primitive, psychologically complex, and fundamentally contradictory behavioral tool.
And it exacts massive, hidden democratic and financial costs on our societies, centralizing power, demanding secrecy, and draining resources in a permanent hair-of-the-dog cycle.
And crucially, by constantly confusing the messy political reality of general everyday deterrence with the hyper-rational abstract theories of immediate crisis deterrence, global superpowers are driving a Formula One car through a traffic jam, relying on flawed human beings to act with flawless logical precision in the face of unimaginable stress.
We have mapped out the profound flaws in the blueprints. We've seen the paradox of the shotgun neighbor, the danger of confusing deterrence with compellence, and the epistemological nightmare of proving a negative.
It's a lot to take in.
It is.
Yeah.
But as we look to the future, I want to leave you with a final thought to consider, a reality that Morgan's 1983 framework is just beginning to collide with today.
Okay, what is it?
If the core flaw of deterrence theory is that it assumes humans act like perfectly rational calculating machines, what happens when we actually hand the keys over to the machines?
Oh, wow.
As modern militaries increasingly integrate artificial intelligence and automated kill chains into their nuclear command structures, we are entering uncharted territory. An AI algorithm does not feel lurking fear. It does not care about saving face. It does not satisfy because it lacks processing power. It calculates millions of outcomes in a millisecond.
Right.
If deterrence relies on the primitive psychological terror of human death to prevent war, what happens to global peace on the day that a completely fearless, hyper-rational algorithm decides that the math of unacceptable damage is actually perfectly acceptable?
Yeah, it is a chilling frontier to consider. We might finally get the perfect, emotionless calculators the Cold War theorists dreamed of, only to realize the fear they lagged was the only thing keeping us alive. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the invisible systems that shape our reality, keep looking past the mathematical illusions, and keep diving deeper.